In my 30s, I thought if I could learn the lesson of 7 people's lives, I'd have a great life. Everyone has at least one story worth hearing and one lesson worth knowing. In 2009, Debbie and I joined Parker Hills Bible Fellowship. That put us in community with a number of people we've learned from. One was Miss Pearl, an elderly woman of great dignity. At the White Elephant Christmas gift exchange, guess who picked the gorilla mask that we brought? Naturally, this dignified, respected figure did. Untroubled, she put it on and waved her arms over her head threateningly. Even more core than her dignity and good humor was her laser-like focus on the gospel. Miss Pearl came to me after a sermon and said, "You can't tell people to believe the gospel. They don't know what that means. You have to explain it." When I returned a book to Josh after my next sermon, I said, "This book was very helpful. Not as helpful as Miss Pearl, but very helpful." I am richer for having known Miss Pearl. We heard stories from many people about her late husband, Sam. Sam was a joyful evangelist who used humor to disarm people and get to know them. Everybody felt welcome around Sam. I wish I'd known Sam, but I'm glad to have known Miss Pearl and wish other people had gotten to know her. Today we have the great privilege and benefit of having a number of older saints in our church. I'm interviewing one of them, Ralph Whitlock. He was married longer than most of us have been alive. He and Marilyn raised 2 kids. He served in World War II and the Korean War. He remembers World War II rationing. He had family members die in the Spanish flu epidemic 100 years ago. He remembers Civil War veterans from his childhood. Ralph served as an elder and continued as a leader in ministry. In so-called retirement, he and Marilyn did a lot of work volunteering for the church. He's replaced all of the lighting systems in our buildings at least 3 times, I think, and installed new lighting for the music ensemble. He put a large number of cool extras into the building, indicators that a light was left on downstairs, a button to slowly raise or lower all the auditorium lights, and switches on timers. One way, in fact, to summarize the history of our church over the last 10 years is that we keep stealing ideas from Ralph. Ashley and Julia, Ralph and Marilyn were some of the self-volunteering greeters. Now many more people have joined them. Ralph started a small prayer group on Wednesdays because he was convinced that the church needed that, and he is a man of prayer. Now we have care groups, with most of the church participating and being blessed by the mutual care and prayer time and teaching each other. For years, Ralph was our lone deacon. Now we have a small army of deacons caring for the church body. Ralph's retirement has been a model to a number of us. He retired early, went to work in the life of the church. Again, recently, we've really tried to focus on discipleship, and Ralph has tried to grow in his discipleship over time. Ralph is a cheerful man, and it's a temptation to misunderstand that as primarily a natural inclination. The bigger reason is that he has deliberately acted in obedience to Christ. I've said that I want to be Ralph when I grow up. Remarkable health and ability, even into his 90s. He was looking at his smartphone once and telling me, "Things are so much better now. I can just look things up on Google." He'll tell you about his voice lessons. There's always just so much more to learn. But what I really want for all of us to learn from Ralph and each other is to devote ourselves to following Jesus and doing so in a wise, thoughtful, strategic, and determined way. There are more ideas left to steal from Ralph. Memorizing scripture, doing specific things to be a better husband, always pressing forward. Ralph wants you to learn from his mistakes, benefit from his experience, and above all, to love Jesus and live for him. So enjoy this interview. Now tell me about your life, Ralph Whitlock. If at some point you decide I'm not interviewing you well enough, just take over and do both sides. All right, so I invited my brother over because he's a real history fan, so I thought he would want to hear, because some of your answers are going to be, some of the things I think we'll discuss will be World War II or Korean War or things.
Sure.
And so I was going to let him ask a few questions also.
Okay.
Plus, he helped me develop some of these questions.
Yeah, good.
Okay. So a lot of people, World War II is just sort of impossibly far away. For my brother and me, it doesn't seem that far away. It was guys just a little older than our dad who were in that. So where were you when you heard about Pearl Harbor?
Actually, I lived about 4 miles out in the country. I was on a farm, and we had a radio. It was operated by battery. The batteries were dead. The newspaper came at about 3 o'clock on Monday afternoon, generally, if the roads were decent. A little later if they weren't, because they were dirt roads. But I walked to school that morning, and usually what would happen in that school, it was about 40, 45 students. It was 3-year high school, and there was an area that was like a recreation room, sort of a lobby, I might say, but there was a ping pong table in there, and I think a pool table. And so I walked in that morning, and everything was different, a very solemn mood that was over everything. People were standing around little groups talking, and I said to somebody, "What in the world is going on?" They said, "We're all going to war. We're all going to war." I said, what are you talking about?" They said, "Pearl Harbor got bombed. The Japs bombed Pearl Harbor." I said, "Well, what's a Pearl Harbor?" I had no clue what Pearl Harbor was. And so our teacher brought to assembly, it was in the biggest room that we had. He brought a radio, and we heard the declaration, the Emperor of Japan has, done a dastardly deed and all that kind of thing, and so he was asking for a declaration of war. So we heard that on the radio.
Okay, and I've heard it played back. It must have been quite shocking at the time to hear.
Yeah, everybody was stunned. And of course, the nation, there was just a general mood of how could they, this sneak attack. And there was a lot of suspicion. And, history, hindsight is always 2020. But it was a sneak attack, and we had some 2,000 people killed and so forth. And when we look back on what President Roosevelt did, it's been heavily criticized because he did infringe on the Japanese Americans' rights by interning them. But at the time, there was such a suspicion of the enemy within that the nation was in fear of the people who lived within. They were afraid that they would commit sabotage and so forth. And a lot of talk about the fifth column, and watch for the enemy within and that kind of thing. So it was readily accepted. And that's the problem with uh, that kind of thinking, because he really did take away their rights, And a lot of those young fellows later that were in those internment camps became part of that 442nd Regiment that really did a wonderful job of code breaking and so forth, and and there were heroes, but they couldn't fight in the Japanese war. They didn't let them fight on that side. They sent them to Europe, but they were tremendous, and they were kind of like the Indians, the code talkers. There were some similarities there, but they were real heroes. And I had a dear friend, Lillian Hayashi, and after the war, I met her, and she had lived in California at the time, and she was a graduate of Moody Bible Institute, and fine Christian gal, and she carried a lot of bitterness in her heart. She said, my folks came over in 1926, and they loved America, and we lost our family business. We were interned, and America did us wrong. And looking back, we did them wrong,
How old were you when Pearl Harbor was attacked?
I was 17. No, I'm sorry. I was, I had turned 15 in July. So I was over 15 and a half, going on 16 when the war started.
Okay.
And I was in high school.
Okay.
So you said it was a 3-year high school.
Yeah, it was a 3-year in the high school in a small rural area. And the 4th year, the kids were bused to another town about 15 miles away, something like that. I never did make that last year. By that time, I was in the Navy.
All right. So you enlisted before graduating then?
That's right. I enlisted at the age of 17. It's a long story, and we don't have time for the whole story, but I was the youngest of 13 children. My father had 8. My father had 5. His wife died, married my mother, and then they had 8 together, and I was the last one, the youngest child. He died when I was 3 months old, and just as an aside that you might find interesting, there was a horrific pandemic in 1917 that hit my family very hard. My half brother, I had 2 brothers, 2 half brothers who were in the army in World War I. One was in Europe, and the younger one was 18 years old. He was in Fort Dix, New Jersey, and he died of the flu. So that's my half brother, my father's son. And then my mother and he had a boy, Harold, who was a year and a half. He died of the flu. And my mother had an 11-day-old little girl, Ruth Marine. She died of the flu. So I have a direct brother and sister who died in that flu. And my mother told me about it. She didn't talk much about it, but she did tell me about the fact that they were, everybody who wasn't sick was taking care of those who were. And so as a result of that, he was, my father had been a Mason. And so us kids went to an orphanage home. And it was a wonderful, wonderful orphanage, Illinois Masonic Orphans Home. And so I went there when I was 3 years old. And at 11 years old, my mother remarried. And I went from a home of about 200 kids all the way from 3 to 18. And with everything, you had depression didn't hurt us a bit. Suddenly, I found myself on a farm in southern Illinois with a very abusive stepfather. And so before long, I left home and went to work for another farmer, and always felt like an outsider. They had children, but I always never felt I was part of anything. And so I left and was up in Chicago when when I turned 17, I was in Chicago. And one thing I tell people, and when I do my veteran presentation on radio, TV, or in schools or clubs or whatever, I always start out with the fact that at 17, I had 3 life-changing experiences. The first was that I met a person who led me to faith in Jesus Christ. And that was a big change in my life and has gotten better as the years have gone by and gave me a spiritual foundation. The second was I met a girl by the name of Marilyn, and she wrote to me all the time. I was in the Navy. And after the war, we married the day before I was 20. And we were married 67 years. And the other, of course, was that I went in the Navy. That was a life-changing experience. So I had 3 life-changing experiences, and the 2 of them came to an end, but one will never end. And that's that relationship with Christ. It started me off on a different path.
When you enlisted, did any of your friends enlist at the same time? I've heard that happen sometimes. Groups of friends would do so.
No, but when I talked about that little high school, one of the fellow, I remember he said, "We're all going to war." And as I look back, every fella in there did go to war. And I remember bumping into one guy, Chester. I bumped into him down in Norfolk, Virginia. And then after the war, I bumped into one of my friends who had become a lieutenant and literally grew up. He was a little guy, and we called him Pee Wee Dolson. And he literally grew up. I didn't recognize him because he did all his growing in the service. But there were a couple of them that were killed. And just about everybody went in the service, There was a popular song at the time, and it went like this. They're either too young or too old. They're either too gray or too grassy green. What's good is in the army. What's left will never harm me. They're either too young or too old. And so that, a lot of people were deferred because they were essential. When I first started my electrical career after World War II, a fellow in my church was an electrician, and he got me in as an electrician. He was 35 when I met him. I was 20, and he said he couldn't have enlisted if he wanted to because he was considered essential to the war effort.
Okay.
Where did you go for training?
I went to Great Lakes, Illinois, and then after Great Lakes, I went. That was 12 weeks, and I came back to Norfolk, and because I lived in Southern Illinois, I went down there and visited, and then I came back up to Chicago, saw Maryland, and then left and and took a train, which was a mistake. I took the last train, and I missed my connections in Cincinnati, and by a half hour. And then by the time I got into Norfolk, I was 7 hours late. So I went in a special camp called Prisoner at Large, and I was in there for 10 days. And it was like Hell Week, like the SEALs do, you know. And that's literally what they called it, a Hell Week. And by the time I got out of that, I was in tremendous physical condition by the time I got out of that week. And then the funny thing was that some of the exercises, they had a big thing you climbed and had to go up and down the rope nets in and out and so forth. And they put our ship's crew through that. I did it about 3 times because I'd been doing it every day. And I was in tremendous shape. And other guys were like I was the first few days. They could hardly do it. But as a result of that, instead of going on the USS Missouri, which was the ship most of my crew members, my boot camp guys went on, I went on the destroyer Escort instead, a small destroyer. And that was where I had my adventures.
What was the name of the destroyer Escort?
USS Halloran. Okay. We made up a little song about it on the gun watch. You know, you get on a gun watch and you are hours and hours of boredom. 4 hours on, 8 hours off, and you might be like 12 to 4 in the morning, or 4 till 8, or 8 to 12 at night. And so I was fortunate. I had some guys who liked to sing. And I always loved to sing. As a kid, I loved to sing, and I still do. And anyway, there was a song we made up. There was a popular song that there was a movie came out that to our ship, and they used to, when we were in the atolls, we used to watch movies at night. And they'd put a screen between 2 destroyers, and then each ship would use their projector, so you keep it going. But there was a movie that came out on the life of George M. Cohan, and Jimmy Cagney was the star of it. But there was a song in that movie that was Harrigan spells Harrigan. And so we used to sing, especially on moonlight night. We'd sing, there were 4 of us around the gun watch, and we'd harmonize and we'd sing, shine on, harvest moon up in the sky. I ain't had no lovin' since January, February, that song. And so we made up this song little by little and about our ship. The USS Halloran, named after Ensign William Halloran, who was killed on the Arizona in Pearl Harbor. And HALLORAN spells Halloran. She's a feisty little D in the Navy, plunging through the seas so blue and wavy. HALLORAN, you see. We will fight, we will serve for the pride of the Halloran. Halloran D 305.
You got to get the 305 in there.
Yeah, that was our whole number. And we had some experiences on that. I earned 4 battle stars on it. And if you look in the Navy records on your cell phone, you'll find that the USS Halloran, they get some stuff wrong. They only gave us 3 battle stars. We were on the Battle of Peleliu, the invasion of Peleliu. And then we were in the invasion of, well, actually, the whole operation of the Philippines. And then we were in Iwo Jima at that one. And we were right up front on that one, right up as close as we could get to the beach. And then we were at Okinawa, which was our worst one. And that's where we got hit by a kamikaze, after having shot down 2 of them.
So I think I know what the gun watch does, but what is that duty, gun watch?
Well, what happened? Guns are manned, and all the battle stations are manned 24 hours a day by 3 watch sections, and so my regular battle station, for just a regular battle station, was pass the ammunition on the forward 3-inch guns. That was we were in that ammunition line. But my regular battle watch station was on it was an English gun, a 4-barrel 1.1, and it was like a 40 millimeter, very similar to a 40 millimeter. And so we would shoot that, like when we were going into an island after being out, they'd send planes out and they'd shoot. And so we would fire those guns, but we were not the main crew. We were just there to fire it until the regular crew got there, and then we'd head to our battle station. And another thing we would periodically do would be the guys, they never kept anybody on the wheel, on the steering wheel of the ship more than a half hour. And so we would rotate and go up and steer the ship for a half hour, and then go back to our watch station. Another guy would come, and then they had the regular guys who steered it, most of the time. But that's the way we did that. So that was kind of my watch station. And we practiced and did a lot of that where we could do it in our sleep. But we were not the main gun crew. And we had 3-inch 50s, 3-inch 50s. We had Hedgehogs for anti-aircraft. We had depth charges. My ASW station for submarines, and a submarine was on what they call a K gun. And of course, that's quite different from the aircraft, thing. And so that was, I had two battle stations, one for aircraft and one for submarines. And we were death on submarines. We were very good on submarines. And so, in fact, we, in the Philippine campaign, we escorted oilers, we escorted supply ships, we escorted aircraft carriers, and we were out one time with several aircraft carriers, and all of a sudden a ship came out. Two destroyers came in with a tanker and refueled the aircrafts, everybody there. And then we left that night and took that aircraft, that tanker back to Ulithi, which was an atoll where we would go in, and we took it back and left at night. And the next morning, they ran into the main element of the Japanese flight. The group we were with ran into the Yamato and 26 destroyers and a couple cruisers. And one of our destroyer escorts actually sank a Japanese cruiser. That was called the last tin can battle, last surface engagement of World War II. And I just missed that. And most of the ships were sunk because they were up against a formidable enemy there. But they managed to turn the Japanese fleet around. And I've always been thankful that we missed that, because our ship did not carry torpedo tubes. We didn't have heavy armament, and thankful I missed that battle.
Well, I'm thankful too. I don't think we would have ever met had you been in
Yeah.
on that battle.
Yeah,
Yeah, that was a real David and Goliath
yeah, that
engagement.
was horrific. They thought they were, Japanese actually thought they were running into Halsey. I mean, they had a strategy to pull Halsey away. We had been in the Leyte invasion. We weren't right up on the beach or anything, but we were out with supply ships out there in that. And so that had happened. And then we had gone back to Ulithi and take those tankers back. And then we got up on our regular deal and got with these carriers, instead of that was because we escorted all kinds of ships. And so that particular run was off of Samar. And when I went to the University of Ohio, where I was one of the speakers in 2017, 2015, they had it really laid out well. And for the first time, I saw exactly where we were. And I'd always heard it called the Battle of Samar, but the Japanese were sending ships down on the west coast of the Philippines and through the straits, and then they were going to come up and try to retake Leyte and pull Halsey up away from Leyte, which belatedly they did pull him away, but he never arrived to the battle. And in the meantime, our people had awareness of what they were doing, and so they got destroyers and parked them at alternate spots on the shore, almost up on the beaches, as close as they could get to the Straits of Mindanao. And they sank that whole Japanese fleet that came through and just torpedoed them and blasted them away. And so that was very unsuccessful for the Japanese. But I was glad that we didn't get in that battle with those aircraft carriers, because that was a mess. And most of those ships were sunk with heavy loss of life.
So I didn't know about that battle until I think last year. My brother loaned me the book Last Stand of the Tin Can Sailors.
Yeah, right. And the USS Joy, Robert, let's see, what was his name? I forget her name now. So we escorted with that ship a lot. What was the name of that ship? I forget now. Yeah.
Okay. So what was your rate in the Navy?
In World War II, I was a seaman. I was just a kid. I was 17, had no skills, went in, and we, I didn't qualify for a rate. By the time I went back in the Korean War, I had been working as an electrician in my apprenticeship. And so I went back in the Navy after it took me about a year because they wouldn't let me go up for it. But I went up and made third class. And then I was due to go up for second class because I was in the reserve, and they could have carried that rate on back for another few years. But I wanted to go up for second class, and I had a lot of the responsibilities, but they wouldn't let me unless I would agree to extend for a year. And I told the electrical officer, if I did that, my wife would shoot me.
So to save your life, yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Good decision.
So I didn't go up for third class, for second, although I had that's a long story, but I had the responsibilities of a chief because the Navy was really in chaos. They had extended people for a year, and then all those people were getting discharged. And so I ended up as a third class being in charge of a whole group of people. So I ended up having to teach them electrical theory and the math that goes along with it and so forth, plus all the ships. By the time I got off that ship, I knew every nook and cranny, everything about it electrically.
Yeah.
Because I was teaching it,